Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today I want to expand on something that I covered briefly in my story of Fujifilm video, which is why shoot Fujifilm. Now, there's a lot of really interesting and unique things about Fujifilm cameras, and I believe that with their feature set, they can be used by anybody from the beginner photographer to an advanced professional cinematographer or photographer. Today, I'm not going to be talking about any specific camera, but more the entire Fuji X line. But I will be referring mostly to modern specs rather than older cameras like my old Fujifilm X-E1. So, with all that out of the way, roll intro. And let's get started. So I'm going to cover the following areas today: the vintage aesthetics and handling, the film simulations and customization, the features across the entire X line, the sensor sizes and what that means for Fujifilm, the lens library, and lastly, price. Now I know I've said a lot of these things before in other videos because I do make a lot of Fuji videos. However, I've never said them all in one video together, so I really wanted to aggregate all of the thoughts that I've had about Fujifilm into one place to help convince somebody who might be on the fence about joining the Fujifilm family to come on over. So let's start with the handling and the vintage aesthetics. Now, starting off with this section, we're talking purely about the externals here. Fujifilm cameras are pretty unique in the sense that they rarely feature a PASM dial, which is a program aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual dial that most mirrorless and DSLR cameras do have. Rather than this, they have individual dials for things like shutter speed and ISO, and a lot of the lenses have aperture rings that allow you to change the aperture directly on the lens. Now this is similar to how older film cameras used to operate because there were no screens to change your settings on. These things evolved later on in cameras, but the earliest film cameras only had these dials for which you could change your settings. Fujifilm started this with the original X100, and they've kept pretty true to it ever since. In addition to the dials, the cameras themselves generally have a vintage aesthetic, evoking classic rangefinder or SLR film cameras. I don't know how many times I have been told, oh, that's a nice Leica, or are you shooting with a Pentax, as I walk around on the street with my cameras? Not that those are the only two film camera brands, but those are two that people that recognize or know a little bit about film cameras might know. Now there are some exceptions to these. The XS10 and the XH line are built more like a traditional camera with PASM dials, larger grips, and plain black exteriors that look more like a normal mirrorless or DSLR camera, albeit a little bit smaller. Or with my Fujifilm X-T30, for example, I don't have the ISO dial. Instead, I can assign ISO to a command wheel, but then I'll still have to look at the screen to know exactly what my ISO is. However, I still do have the shutter speed dial and the aperture ring on some of my lenses. In fact, if you're looking for a Fujifilm lens with an aperture ring, all you have to do is look in the name for R, and that means that it has an aperture ring. So, if you want a camera that has that vintage feel and handling, Fuji really is the way to go. Now, there are some other brands that make cameras with that more vintage aesthetic, like the Nikon ZFC or Olympus's line of cameras. However, all of those cameras do come with caveats, like limited features or lens lineup, or with Olympus, smaller sensor size. Alright, so we've talked about the vintage feel and handling. Let's talk about internally with the film simulations and customization to give your photos a more filmic feel. Now, lots of cameras have creative profiles built in, but Fujifilm takes this a step further with their cameras. Fujifilm is uniquely positioned to do this, being one of the largest film manufacturers from back in the day, as well as still one of the largest film manufacturers still working. They've made a bunch of their film simulations to emulate their own film stocks, but they also do have some original film simulations that are still made to give your photos a more filmic feel and quality. As well, the settings deeper into the menu allow you to really achieve exactly what look you want with your JPEGs straight out of camera. As well, there are multiple Facebook groups and websites full of people that have built their own custom film recipes to emulate certain film stocks. So, if you want to get a specific look for your photos straight out of camera, you can do that. Or, if you want to shoot raw, but try to get those looks still in camera without much post-processing, In camera, you can do raw conversion to those specific profiles, and then even then, after you've done that, you can make more adjustments with those settings that I mentioned. This can be really useful for people who want to take a picture on their camera and then post it pretty much immediately, because you can send those finished photos over to your phone with the Fujifilm app and then immediately have them ready to post, rather than having to put your RAWs into Lightroom, make your adjustments there, and then post them. Now, talking about recipes, I do want to give a shout out to Richie Roche of Fuji X Weekly. His film simulations are available either on his website, fujixweekly.com, or on his mobile app that he's built. And his organization of his film recipes is really great because you can have it organized by the different type of sensor that you're using, based on whether that's Bayer or the original X-Trans all the way through X-Trans 4. And even within the X-Trans 4, there's different features that are in different cameras, so it'll be organized by that as well. He also gives a lot of examples of photos that he's taken with those recipes, and even matches them up against some of the film stocks that he's trying to emulate if he's going for a specific film stock. It really is very easy to navigate and find exactly what you're looking for. Alright, next up, let's talk about features and the entire camera range. Now, Fujifilm has always been at the forefront of camera features. Because they mainly manufacture APS-C sensor size cameras, they do have to do some work to keep up with the manufacturers that are making full frame and APS-C cameras. So to do this, they put some features that are not in any other camera yet into their cameras, such as with the X-T3, it was the first camera to get 4K 60, and with the X-H2S as a crazy 40 shutter flaps per second electronic shutter for burst mode. But beyond this, Fujifilm has really geared all of their separate lines of cameras to meet the needs of different types of photographers and videographers. So the XH line is one of the flagship lines, and those are going to be the fastest and the highest video featured cameras in their entire lineup. There will be also the most expensive, and as I said, they're going to have a more traditional feel similar to other mirrorless cameras, and they have the PASM dial and even have a top screen for viewing your settings. The XT single digit line is their secondary flagship line, which are meant for professionals to prosumers who are looking for one of the best hybrid cameras on the market without breaking the bank. And these cameras are styled more like a vintage SLR rather than a modern mirrorless camera. Then there's the X Pro line, which is kind of a third flagship line. These cameras are specifically made for photographers. Though they do carry video features, they really are aimed at photographers, and they have a rangefinder style with an optical and electronic hybrid viewfinder. Next up, there's the XT double digit line, which will inherit a lot of the features from the XT single digit line, but be much more compact and cheaper, and they're really more aimed at the enthusiast photographer or videographer, but they still have really excellent features. As well, there's the XE line, which generally lines up with a lot of the features from the XT 2-digit line, but has a more compact rangefinder style body. And then as well, there is that XS10 that I mentioned, which is kind of in a line of its own right now, and it's sort of like a baby XH with that traditional mirrorless format. At the bottom of the mirrorless camera line, there's the XT 3-digit and the XA line. Now these are going to be really beginner cameras, and they're not going to have the Fuji X-Trans sensor, but they're still going to be packed with a lot of really good features like uncropped 4K, which is something that a lot of cameras didn't have when those came out. Finally, there's the X100 line, which are arguably the best compact fixed lens cameras on the market. Yes, there is the Leica Q line, but the Leica Qs are much bigger, way more expensive, and some of the features that the X100s have beat the Leica Q cameras. So whatever you're looking for, Fuji really has you covered as long as you're okay with APS-C. And they also do have their GFX medium format line, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Alright, sensor tech and sizes are next. Alright, so Fujifilm really focuses only on 2 sensor sizes. They do have some compact cameras with small sensors, but their main focus is on the X mount line and the GFX line, and really much more on the X mount line than the GFX line. The X mounts are, as I said, APS-C sensor size cameras, and because they're not overextending themselves into doing full frame as well, they can really pack the best technology into their APS-C sensors and APS-C cameras. This is why Fujifilm cameras always seem to be at the forefront of APS-C tech, whereas with other manufacturers like Canon, Sony, or Nikon, they're focusing on full frame and then trickling down some of their features to APS-C, and they never really focus on the lens library for APS-C either. Except for Canon with their older DSLR line. However, they've kind of been struggling at figuring out their identity, it seems like, between their double-digit D line, their Rebel line, and the EOS M line, and now the APS-C R line. It's spread really thin, and it's hard to figure out where Canon's going with that. Fuji, only focusing on APS-C, so they don't have to deal with those problems. As well, as I said, they do make medium format cameras. These medium format cameras have incredible features, whether you're talking about photo or even video, and they come in way cheaper than the competition like Leica and Hasselblad. Their GFX 100S can do 4K 30 on a medium format sensor and comes in at only $5,500. And it has 102 megapixels. Crazy. As well, for most of their cameras, Fujifilm uses a proprietary sensor array called the X-Trans sensor. Now, the X-Trans sensor differs from the Bayer sensor array by moving the photo sites to different areas and creating a different pattern. This pattern allows for them to not have to use an anti-aliasing filter, but still have low fringing and moire. And it also has a lower margin for area when you're talking about false color versus the Bayer sensor array. Now, the XT triple digit line and the XA line, as I mentioned earlier, do not have the X-Trans sensor. They have a traditional Bayer sensor, but every other Fuji X camera since the X Pro 1 has had the X-Trans sensor in some form. Finally, Fuji uses phase detection autofocus on their modern sensors. Phase detection autofocus technology works by having two separate beams of light entering the camera and then lining up. However, when they don't line up, the system makes precise changes to the focusing motor to align the images. Now, the other type of autofocus that cameras might carry is called contrast detect autofocus. This works by the camera analyzing all of the pixels and deciding that the photo is in focus when the subject is most contrast heavy. Now, it does this by pushing the focusing point of the lens back and forth until it figures it out. Because of how much work is being done in camera for contrast detect autofocus, it is naturally much slower than phase detect autofocus. Sony, Canon, Nikon, and Fuji use phase detect. Panasonic, Olympus, and Leica and Sigma use contrast detect. There are advantages to contrast detect. It is more accurate. However, if you need to have the fastest autofocus, phase detect is the only way to go. As I said, Sony and Canon are using it, and they have the fastest autofocus with the best hit rate, but Fuji's is getting better and better each iteration. And it is still much faster than any contrast detect autofocus system that exists today. Alright, so the next point is something that I talk about literally every time I talk about Fujifilm cameras, and that's their lenses. So, as I said in the last point, Fuji is solely focused on APS-C with the X-Trans line. That means that they're not making any full-frame lenses, and they can put all of their R&D for lens technology into one range of lenses. And this really shows with the vast library of super high-quality, well-constructed, full metal lenses with varying ranges anywhere from super fast primes to very tiny, lightweight, still fast primes. And then you have telephoto lenses. You have the incredible red badge zoom lenses that maintain the 2.8 aperture throughout their entire range. And then there's even a line of Fujifilm cinema lenses. I think I've mentioned this before, but there is a really good short film that was shot entirely on an X-T3 with Fuji cinema lenses, and I'll link that video in the description below. Another thing to note about the Fujifilm lenses is that they have various features as far as weather resistance, which would be noted with WR in the lens name. As I mentioned before, there's also the aperture ring lenses, which have R in the name. As well, there's linear motor lenses with LM, image stabilized with OIS, and power zoom lenses with PZ, although that's really just the XC line. And talking about that XC line, those are extremely affordable kit lenses and budget versions of their nicer lenses, like the XC35 f2, which internally is exactly the same as the XF35 f2, but removes the aperture ring and the metal construction and drops the price to under $200 for an excellent lens. Finally, Fuji has recently opened up their X-mount autofocus lens technology to third-party developers. Now, Viltrox has been making third-party autofocus lenses for Fuji for a long time, but now you're going to get lenses from Sigma, from Tamron, and There's also a bunch of manual focus lenses from 7 Artisans, Rokinon TT Artisans. So there's really a great library of lenses to choose from, and you can even use some speed boosters and adapters to adapt other glass onto Fujifilm cameras, and even in some cases retain autofocus at similar or same speeds as their native camera line. Now the last thing I want to talk about is price. Now this kind of relates back to a lot of the things that I talked about in this video already, but you're getting these incredible features, these amazingly well-built cameras with the really cool vintage aesthetic for insanely good prices. You'll find that Fuji tends to be the king in each price range that they compete in, and if they aren't currently the king in features or price, it's because they have another model that's coming out soon that will put them back on top. Really, everything that you're getting for the price that you pay for their cameras is just unbeatable. Alright, so that about covers everything I wanted to talk about in this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Hopefully you can share this with somebody who is thinking about joining the Fujifilm family to help them make their final decision. As well, if you want to look at any of the cameras that I mentioned in the lineup earlier, there will be links below to the current generation of each of those lines in the description. All right, have a great one.